Good evening and welcome to the Understanding and Navigating Clinical Trials webinar presented by the Colon Cancer Alliance in partnership with EmergingMed and Fight Colorectal Cancer, and funded by an educational grant provided to the Colon Cancer Alliance by Amgen. My name is Donna Quinlan and I'm the Program Director with the Colon Cancer Alliance. For those of you who are not familiar with the Colon Cancer Alliance, I want to briefly mention who we are and tell you a little bit about the programs we offer. The Colon Cancer Alliance is the largest and oldest national nonprofit for people affected by colorectal cancer. We've grown over the last 11 years from a small grassroots online support group to a national patient advocacy organization dedicated to ending the suffering caused by colorectal cancer. The Colon Cancer Alliance increases screening rates and survivorship by providing support and education and furthering research and advocacy efforts. Some of the Colon Cancer Alliance signature programs include our toll-free helpline, peer-to-peer buddy program, online colorectal cancer community, mycrcconnections.com, Undy 5000 5K Run, Voices Volunteer Program, and the National Colorectal Cancer Conference. To learn more about the Colon Cancer Alliance's programs, call our toll-free helpline at 877-422-2030 or visit our website at www.ccalliance.org. I would like to give Carly Bowman of Fight Colorectal Cancer, one of our partners in tonight's webinar, an opportunity to welcome you. Carly?
Thank you, Donna. I just wanted to welcome everyone who's on the call. Fight Colorectal Cancer is thrilled to be a part of this project with the Colon Cancer Alliance and EmergingMed. A little bit about Fight Colorectal Cancer. You may know us from our former name, which was C3 Colorectal Cancer Coalition. We changed our name in March of this year. We are a colorectal cancer advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. We empower survivors to raise their voices, and we train advocates around the country. And we educate lawmakers and push them to make better policies for people living with colorectal cancer. We offer support for patients, family members, and caregivers, and we serve as a resource for colorectal cancer advocates, policymakers, medical professionals, and healthcare providers. Additionally, we do everything we can to increase and improve research at all stages of development and for all stages of cancer, and we directly fund cancer research as well. You can learn more about the organization and find out ways that you can get in touch with us by going to fightcolorectalcancer.org or calling our answer line at 877-427-2111. Thanks again.
Now I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. Robert Rotigliano is Medical Information Director at EmergingMed. Robert is a research scientist with 10 years of laboratory experience in molecular genetics and medical microbiology. Through a National Science Foundation training fellowship under the guidance of Dr. Daphna Barsaghi, Robert's research focused on signal transduction and cellular imaging of living cells in oncology. Robert has successfully parlayed his experience as a bench scientist into the role of incomparable educator of and advocate for patients as targeted therapies, molecular diagnostics, and gene expression profiling have become the centerpiece of cancer research and modern medicine. Robert earned a BA in history from James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and a PhD in molecular genetics and medical microbiology from Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, New York. Our other speaker, Panita Simon, is Director of Clinical Trials Information Service Operations at EmergingMed. Panina oversees EmergingMed's patient advocacy group programs. She ensures that EmergingMed's advocacy partners are able to provide patients with clinical trial awareness and access through one-on-one personalized services. One of Panina's most exciting and rewarding projects at EmergingMed has been to build coalitions of disease-specific advocacy groups to create joint patient education and outreach campaigns while cultivating partnerships with pharmaceutical companies to fund these initiatives. She has also represented EmergingMed's pharmaceutical partners trials at national and international medical conferences. Prior to EmergingMed, Panina served in hospital administration at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. There, she helped hundreds of cancer patients along the path from initial office visit through their ultimate treatment decisions, including enrolling in clinical trials. Panina also earned certification from Project LEAD, the National Breast Cancer Coalition Science and Advocacy Training Program. I will now turn it over to the first of our two speakers tonight, Robert Rutigliano. Robert?
Thank you, Donna. Thank you for the nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be at this webinar. I'd like to start off, and I'd like to give everybody a little bit of background on clinical trials, and then we move into a little bit more about some of the details of clinical trials themselves and why to participate, and give you a better grasp of what they are. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll hand it over to Panina, who can go into some more of the details of the clinical trial matching service that we're working with the Colon Cancer Alliance. So to begin, in its simplest form, a clinical trial can be thought of as a test. And this is a test to see if a drug or a treatment will be effective in treating human disease. Clinical trials are basically the final stages of medical research that began in the laboratory, and they're necessary to evaluate new approaches to cancer prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and even improve the quality of life. So often research will move from the lab to tests on animals, but treatments that work well in animals do not necessarily mean that they'll work well in people. So it is important to test new discoveries in patients to understand if they are safe and effective. There are a number of things that clinical trials are seeking to investigate: new drugs, new combinations of drugs, new dosing of drugs, different frequency of established drugs. Clinical trials are also looking to test new diagnostic ways to find out about your cancer, new screening tests. There's new surgical procedures under study, new radiation therapy procedures. There's also behavioral interventions such as diet and exercise, psychosocial interventions such as counseling, and these are all interventions that could perhaps change the quality of somebody's life. But I think it's important for everybody to remember that basically all of the people who take a drug or a treatment for a disease at any point are standing on the shoulders of somebody who actually participated in a clinical trial. So they're a very important part of our medical system today. So for the patient's safety, new treatments are tested in distinct phases. Each phase is designed to answer different research questions. Phase 1 studies are the first studies in people, and they help evaluate how a new drug should be given, how often it should be given, and what dose is safe and how it affects the body. Importantly, only a small number of people with various tumor types will enroll in these studies. So it's not always just one tumor type. These will be open to a wide variety of tumor types. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when hearing about Phase 1 studies. Phase 2 studies continue to test the safety of the drug, and they begin to evaluate how well the new drug is working. Phase 2 studies usually focus on a particular type of cancer. And if the results from a Phase 2 study show potential benefits, this will often go on to a Phase 3 study. Now, Phase 3 studies are going to test a new drug, a new combination of drugs, new procedures, and compare them to the current standard. The current standard being the current standard of care, what's normally given for a particular situation. These studies often enroll large numbers of people, and this is at centers throughout the country. And positive results here will often lead to new standards of care that you'll hear about in treatment centers. Another phase of trials that I didn't list here are Phase 4 trials, and finally these phases of trials are aiming to assess the long-term safety and effectiveness of a new treatment. So before you are offered the option of participating in a clinical trial, there are many considerations, many of which are outlined in the protocol. Protocol ensures that all patients in the study are treated in the same way. It is basically a detailed plan of the clinical trial. And here you'll find documentation on the rationale for conducting the trial, the goals of the trial, who is eligible to participate in the trial, and you might also hear about this referred to as eligibility criteria, which is basically a list of factors that make sure patients are receiving treatments that are similar. Protocol also outlines the actual treatments interventions, any tests that will be given, the type of monitoring that will be performed during the trial, and how often it will be watched, and what information will be collected. So again, the protocol is really a set of guidelines that help protect participants and produce sound results by ensuring the clinical trials are carried out according to strict scientific and ethical principles. Additionally, in order to further ensure patient safety, a protocol must be approved by something known as an institutional review board, or you might hear the term IRB, which is basically a panel made up of leading researchers, community leaders, and the IRB is often accompanied with a data safety and monitoring board that's going to follow the study closely and make sure that the results The results and the treatments are monitored closely as well. So another important part of participating in a clinical trial is a process called informed consent. Informed consent is the process in which a patient is given important facts about the clinical trial before deciding whether or not to participate. Informed consent includes information about the possible risks, the benefits, and the limits of the trial. So this is the ideal time for you to ask any and all questions you may have. And it's imperative that you fully understand the treatment, the risks, and the benefits. And once you do, you will be asked at that point to sign a consent form. But it's important here to also note that you can leave a study at any time, and even after this consent form is signed. Let's advance to the next slide. So why should you consider clinical trials? Well, there's a number of reasons, a few of which I've listed here. The first being to play an active role in your health care. And every time you make a treatment decision, you deserve to have information about all possible treatment options. Another reason is to potentially gain access to new drugs and interventions. Sometimes the standard of care may not fit your unique situation. Clinical trials may offer an alternative option. Finally, you may want to obtain quality care. And we put this here, the assurance that your health care is being provided by the leading physicians and that you'll be closely monitored for any changes or side effects. And of course, it's also worth mentioning that by participating in a clinical trial, you're not only potentially helping yourself, but also others who find themselves in the same situation. So moving on to this, why should you consider clinical trials? An interesting survey released about 10 years ago found that 85% of patients were not aware of clinical trials as a viable treatment option. But 75% of these patients said they would have participated in trials. So our goal is to help patients relate to this idea of clinical trials and cancer research in a different way. Not by being frightened that they are a guinea pig or will be getting a placebo instead of treatment, but that clinical trials have a natural place in the continuum of care. As cancer researchers, doctors, that try to find the gold standard of how to treat the cancer at multiple points in time along this continuum. So it's important that patients know all their options when making treatment decisions. Often there's a very narrow window of eligibility. So this narrow window of eligibility could be based on prior treatments. Once you receive a treatment, possibly you're not eligible for a trial that was looking for an untreated patient. So we never want to hear that I wish I would have known about this. So it's all about empowering the patient with all possible treatment options. And patients have the right to make these informed decisions. They need to understand how treatment decisions are made, and it's also important to understand that there's misperceptions out there. For instance, the idea that treatment trials use placebos. This is rarely the case. Cancer clinical trials rarely ever use a placebo, and usually the control group in a clinical trial will be the standard of care. So it's important that everybody understands the questions to ask, the risks and the benefits, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that all the patients have all the information to make an informed decision. So how are the treatment decisions made? So cancer is a very complex disease. It's critical to understand as much as possible about the condition so that the best treatment decision can actually be made. So your doctor is going to want to understand as much as he or she can about your personal medical situation. You're going to want to understand, of course, what type of cancer do you have, but maybe some more details about the pathology, the histology, types of cells that are making up your tumor. Perhaps the biology, the specific traits of your tumor. You might have heard terms like biomarkers or mutations. These are all things that can really help understand the diagnosis and the specific diagnosis of your cancer. How advanced is your cancer? Has it appeared in one spot? Has it been detected in the lymph nodes, possibly other parts of your body? These are all critical pieces of information that will dictate the next steps. What sorts of treatments have you already received? How have you responded to those treatments? Has the cancer gone away and then come back? Has it been refractory to treatments? Again, trials will actually come at each one of these points, so it's imperative that you know each of these steps, each of these points of care. What other medical conditions do you have? What is your overall health like? This may be important to gauge the intensity of treatments that may be appropriate for you. So another key thing to think about, what goes into this is not only what goes into this treatment decision, but when are these decisions being made? When is it appropriate to think about clinical trials as an option? It's important to realize that clinical trials are being conducted at every stage of a cancer diagnosis. clinical trials are not there just for people in later stages of the disease. Specifically, I've listed out a couple of appropriate times when one should explore clinical trials, perhaps before biopsy. And this could be to study biomarkers from the tissue that's being extracted. For the first surgery or radiation treatment, there are studies out there called neoadjuvant studies, which look to try a new treatment before that surgery or radiation treatment to see if that does a more effective job treating the cancer. Immediately after surgery or radiation treatment, these are known as adjuvant studies. Again, somebody might do a surgical resection of a tumor and may want to see if chemotherapy after the surgery yields better results. When cancer has recurred or spread, another term for metastasized, is another point where we want to make a treatment decision and know all options out there. When the cancer is spreading despite current treatment, is it refractory? There are second-line and third-line clinical trials that are targeting those questions specifically. So to put this in the perspective of the patient a little bit more, based on our conversations with close to 250,000 cancer patients over the last 10 years we've worked with, we've found some common thoughts that people have that may make it an appropriate time to consider clinical trials. So for instance, if you find yourself saying, I'm looking for what might be new for my cancer, this is an ideal time to explore clinical trials that may be talking about new drugs and therapies, access to the latest developments and the latest technologies. Maybe you hear yourself saying, I'm having difficulty understanding what treatment to choose, and this could be meaning that you're not satisfied with the current standards of care, or your doctor is saying there's no more options for me. So you want to move beyond that spectrum and see what's a wider picture and know all of your treatment options. Perhaps you're newly diagnosed and you want to know how to proceed. Well, this is a perfect time, again, to know everything that's out there. There's no harm in just being informed and finding out all of the treatment options that are available to you. To talk with your doctor, to talk with your family about, to talk to others in the community about. Your doctor may be recommending something like chemotherapy or surgery or radiation, but you've heard about side effects or you've heard about something that doesn't interest you in that or the frequency of the treatment, and you'd like to try something else. Well, knowing that there's something out there beyond the standards of care is a good time to be informed. So if one does understand that clinical trials make sense, how do people typically learn about them? Well, there's a number of ways, but the standard ways tend to be from their doctors, the media, whether it be newspapers, radio, magazines, friends and family, internet searches. These are all common ways we hear that people find out about clinical trials. But more needs to be done. The latest numbers I found, over 10 million people are living with cancer and millions more are diagnosed every year. But back to that same statistic, only 3 to 5% are opting to join into a clinical trial. So as we mentioned before, this is due to a number of things, but a lack of awareness, a lack of access, and this is where we've basically joined forces with the Colon Cancer Alliance to help empower patients to know all of their treatment options. One of the goals of the clinical trials matching service that we work with is the goal here is to create the opportunity for patients to make informed treatment decisions throughout. And we do this by increased access to accurate and verified information. What I mean by that is we make a point to validate as much of the clinical trial information as possible. Not only the information that the trial is about, but the clinical trial sites that the trial is going on at, the people to talk to at the trial site, trying to make this experience as smooth as possible and validating that information along the way so there's no ruts through the process. We're also trying to increase awareness, and we're doing this by maintaining a robust, up-to-date database of all publicly available clinical trials, and we work to promote the use of the free and confidential matching system, promote this as much as possible. And then finally, we help the informed decisions by providing a staff of clinical trial navigators that can educate, provide guidance on the basics of the process. And this is a free and confidential service, and they're there just to answer your questions, to show you what's available, to relay any of this information, and to help kind of move yourself and navigate through this information. So before I hand over the presentation to Panina, who will take you through a little bit more of the detailed workings of the clinical trial matching service, I just wanted to offer some basic information about the matching service itself. So to date, we've seen and met over 200,000 web and phone profiles. Actually, we've created about the last 6 years. So these are created by patients, loved ones, healthcare professionals that find the service either through the web or call directly on the phone. Our call center averages over 250 contacts a week. can see I have their new and follow-up. So this means these are new calls, but also follow-up calls. And follow-up call is basically a return call to a constituent that is based on them asking for a follow-up call. Maybe they're going for a treatment, and we're going to call them back after the treatment to see how the treatment went. Maybe that's an opportune time for them to start researching trials. So our range is up to 1 to 45 different calls. So a real relationship is built here. And what this is, we encourage people to call back and find trials and find information at different points of care. Importantly, we've shown that we're increasing the enrollment. Our overall average enrollment rate in trials is 8%. We've seen as high as 22%. So the service is making a fundamental difference. And finally, just to let you know about what's in that database that I discussed briefly before, these all publicly available trials. So there's treatment trials, there's supportive care trials, prevention trials, early detection trials. And the database is growing every day. So you should have confidence that it's an accurate, large, robust database that should be a clear resource for you, family, friends, and know that there's a confidential phone service behind it that should be able to educate and answer your questions along the way. So with that, I'm going to hand over the controls to Panina, who's going to basically review the workings of the clinical trial matching service in more detail. And I look forward to taking your questions at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Rob. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. If I can extend a special thank you to Donna Quinlan of the Colon Cancer Alliance for organizing this event. She's done a tremendous job. Thank you, Donna. So you've heard a little bit from Rob about clinical trials. How can you access the clinical trials matching service that EmergingMed is powering in partnership with the Colon Cancer Alliance and Fight Colorectal Cancer? What you see in front of you now is a basic overview. You can reach the matching service either via the Colon Cancer Alliance website, the Fight Colorectal Cancer website, or a toll-free number that I'll give you a little bit later on. Once you access us either by phone or by web, you'll be put in contact with a clinical trials specialist or clinical trials navigator. They're there to help you complete a profile based on your diagnosis and treatment history, allow you to match to clinical trials that match your unique situation, provide you phone-based support and education, and then refer you on to a trial site. A trial site is a medical center or doctor's office that's conducting a clinical trial. As Rob mentioned a little bit earlier, we specify here that they're IRB-approved clinical trial sites. All of the sites that we would refer you to have been approved by an institutional review board. And then what does matching actually mean? Either starting online or on the phone, you would complete a brief questionnaire. And again, we say profiles and questionnaires interchangeably, so I apologize if I switch back and forth. But the questionnaire is 15 to 20 questions about your diagnosis, what sort of cancer you have, the stage of your cancer, and the treatment you've already received. This is along the same principles that Rob mentioned earlier of how treatment decisions are made. You would submit the questionnaire. If you're doing this online, you just click the little submit button. If you're doing this over the phone with a clinical trials navigator, they would submit it via their unique software. It goes into the database. The database matches your answer choices from your unique questionnaire against what clinical trials are looking for, what sort of patients the clinical trials are looking for. You'll see a list of results. If you're online, you'll see them come up in front of you. If you're on the phone, they'll come up in front of your clinical trials navigator, and they can discuss with you which of those trials might be of interest to you. You would select the trials that are of interest to you and the locations where those trials are being conducted that are of interest to you. And if you're doing this online, you can call right away to speak to a clinical trials navigator, or a clinical trials navigator will give you a call back based on the contact information you put into the system. And who are these clinical trials navigators? We know that whenever there's complex information, it's really so helpful and so important to have someone who understands the information, who can take the time to explain it to you and to walk you through the process. Clinical trials navigators are health educators that are there to help you learn about your own cancer diagnosis so that you can submit the questionnaire appropriately and understand how treatment decisions are made for you. They're there to educate you about the basics of clinical trials and cancer research. And if you do come in with any ideas that may not be so accurate or things that you've heard, they're there to help you understand what's true, what isn't true, weed through all of the information that might be out there and see what's true and what's appropriate for you. We cultivate in them good listening and good coaching skills, and they in turn can help you communicate better with your doctor. And then they also have additional resources available to you. If it's financial assistance resources, transportation resources, psychosocial support, the resources that are available within the Colon Cancer Alliance and Fight Colorectal Cancer. Based on your needs, they're able to provide you with those resources. Now, the nuts and bolts. How to reach the service itself. There's a toll-free number dedicated to this clinical trials matching service with the Colon Cancer Alliance and Fight Colorectal Cancer. So you can dial 866-278-0392. Don't have to worry about taking that number down right now. It's available on both websites, the Colon Cancer Alliance website and the Fight Colorectal Cancer website. There's also the online version of the questionnaire available on both websites, either ccalliance.org or fightcolorectalcancer.org. We'll just show you what that web page for the matching service looks like. You'll see the two piled on top of each other. The front one is the Colon Cancer Alliance. The back one is Fight Colorectal Cancer. So two web pages lead to the same service, and they're nearly identical. They'll give you some very basic information in text about what clinical trials are and how the service works. If you see that blue bar across the top, you can click right there to find a match. If you've already created a profile, you can click My Profile and be taken back to a profile you've created, or you can select View All Trials. When we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about View All Trials. So if you were to scroll down that same page I just showed you, the bottom of the page looks like this. There's step 1 and step 2. Step 1, select a diagnosis. For most of the people participating in the call, it would be colorectal cancer. We do have different tumor types. We do have prevention and early detection trials as well. The person creating a profile does not have to be the patient. It could be a loved one, a caregiver, a family member, a friend on behalf of the patient as well. You would select a diagnosis. From there, you can either click one of those two buttons in step 2. View All Trials would bring you to a list of all clinical trials for the selected tumor type. So if you selected colorectal cancer, View All Trials would bring you a list of all trials in the United States and Canada that are available to patients with colorectal cancer. You may look at that list of View All Trials and think, just based on the titles of the trials that you see, that some of them might not be right for you. That's completely correct. View All Trials is just the full list. It's not individualized. For individualized information, you would select Find a Match. And by clicking Find a Match, you would be taken to a questionnaire, that questionnaire that I mentioned earlier, the 15 to 20 questions. It changes based on the answer choices. Some additional questions may show up. And that would be a list of trials that match your unique diagnosis, staging, and treatment history. Whether you start on the phone or you start online, you're led to the same place, our call center of clinical trials navigators. And what happens on a typical first call? It really starts with you, understanding what you already know, what you already understand, both about your own diagnosis and about clinical trials. And then the conversation is tailored from there. Every call is personalized. Every call is based on your needs. Some of the things that the clinical trials navigator will discuss with you: appropriate times to search for clinical trials, how treatment decisions are made, some of the concepts Rob discussed earlier, strategies for communicating with your own doctor. When we give you clinical trials matches, we encourage you to go back to your treating physician, discuss those matches with your physician, and see what might be right for you. Referrals to additional resources, those financial assistance, psychosocial support resources we mentioned earlier. And if you come to us with a lot of knowledge about clinical trials, we'll help you expand that knowledge, learn more about the randomization process, the informed consent process, anything that you might need to know. I don't want you to think that what we do here in our call center is the same thing that happens at the trial site. Again, a trial site is a medical center or doctor's office that's conducting a clinical trial. What we do here with the clinical trials navigators and what the clinical trials navigators will do with you over the phone is the preliminary understanding of what clinical trials might be right for you. They want to provide you with education. They want to see, based on those big buckets of staging, diagnosis, and treatment history, if you may be appropriate for certain clinical trials. And the key thing is they want to empower you to be an active participant in your treatment decisions. When they refer you to a trial site, what happens there is what's called the informed consent process. There would be a full medical assessment that would include any other healthcare conditions you have, blood tests, lab tests, those sort of things, to understand if you're appropriate for the clinical trial and you're a good fit for the clinical trial, and if the clinical trial is a good fit for you. After that full pre-screening, then you would begin the process of enrolling into a clinical trial. Rob also mentioned earlier that we provide ongoing follow-up. We do build relationships with the people who call our call center, be it the patient, the family member, the friend. We want to help you as long as you need us. So we average 5 follow-up calls per patient or per constituent, either a patient or a loved one. We'll continue following up with you as long as you give us permission. We'll follow up with you to provide any sort of troubleshooting assistance. If you're trying to reach out to a site and you can't get through to them for some reason, we'll reach out to the site for you. We'll make sure that we have the right contact information for you. If your needs change and you need some new resources, we'll be there to provide those. And most importantly, if there are any changes to your medical condition, if when you call us for the first time, it's not the best time for you to be looking for clinical trials, if you're on a treatment that's working for you, if something else is going right for you and it's not the right time to look for clinical trials, but then something changes, we'll be there at that time to follow up with you and see if there may be new trials that match your unique situation. And that should conclude our prepared information. I will turn it back over to Donna and open the floor to questions.
We will now begin the question and answer part of the webinar. As a reminder, participants who have logged on to the webinar can submit questions for the speakers by typing their question in the box titled Ask a Question. Participants who have called into the webinar can submit questions for speakers by pressing star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. To withdraw your question, please press star, then 2. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to address all of the questions submitted. I'll read each question aloud and then provide time for the speakers to answer. So now we'll begin. One of the questions that we've received is, why would I sign up for a clinical trial when I haven't exhausted all treatment options?
I'll handle this one. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I think it's important, not necessarily that you have to go into a clinical trial. Now, clinical trials are a treatment option, I think, is one way to view it. So when you say when you haven't exhausted all treatment options, that's saying possibly the standards of care, what's normally been out there for your particular situation, for your particular time in that continuum of care. And if you're satisfied with that and your doctor is satisfied with the results that are coming from those treatment options, by all means, that is a road that you're encouraged to go down. But clinical trials are just there as another treatment option. They're legitimate treatments, and they're all different types. Sometimes clinical trial is a simple modification of the standard of care. So if a standard of care is maybe a chemotherapy regimen, maybe this clinical trial is looking at the same chemotherapy regimen but just given once more per week. And that's maybe not something that would be in a standard of care that you're being offered at your facility. So there are subtleties. There are large differences. Clinical trials cover the spectrum. And I think the main point to get across is that you just explore all and look at clinical trials as a valid treatment option throughout each point of your care.
Okay, next question. How do I determine which trial is the one for me if your service comes up with 4 different trials?
That's a great question. And it would be easy, I think, if you only receive 4 trials, because there's so many clinical trials out there that often that number is going to be higher. So I think one of the most important things to do is to engage your physician throughout the course of that decision. If possible, some physicians maybe might guide you from beginning to end. Maybe you're doing this outside of the physician, but we always encourage to go back to the physician and work through it with them. So another way that I've looked at it, and something I've actually been exploring with the service, is putting trials in different buckets that almost gauge somebody's level of willingness to try new things or risk assessment. And what I mean by that is you could have a clinical trial that's testing something that's maybe a completely new type of drug, which I would consider, a very big step for a clinical trial. Whereas something maybe more mild, there may be something like that situation I described before, where it's a slight variation of a chemotherapy regimen. That's more of a conservative clinical trial. So I think it would help to kind of gauge where you fit on that, how willing you are to try something kind of within the realm of the standard of care and how far you want to deviate by that. And then I would also, like I said earlier, really encourage you to speak with your physician, speak with family and friends, really think about the details of the treatment, maybe their frequency or the distance to the site or the type, whether it be a treatment that's given as an oral agent versus something that's an intravenous agent. Maybe that matters. The side effects that you know about potential treatments. You have to weigh all of that into it, really understand the protocol, and then make your decision from there. And it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one by any stretch of the imagination, but I think the more people that you engage, the better you will be, and try to assess all points of the protocol and how they fit into your situation.
Our next question, how are emergency-type calls handled or triaged by the clinical trial navigators? Are those types of situations or special circumstances calls shared back with the organization, in this instance with the Colon Cancer Alliance or Fight Colorectal Cancer?
Another great question.
I'll take that one.
You got it.
Great question. When there are emergency calls, that doesn't come up all that frequently. We answer 95% of all calls live. So chances are, if you call through, you're going to reach a clinical trials navigator directly. If for any chance you do not reach a clinical trials navigator directly, or you're calling late at night, the typical hours for the call center are 8:30 to 6 Eastern Standard Time. We would return your call within 3 business hours. If there is a case such as someone starting a treatment in the next day or two and really wants to find their options right away, they can work directly with a clinical trials navigator. The navigator would encourage you to bring any sort of trial match results back to your treating physician, and we can certainly help you reach a trial site as quickly as possible. We can worm transfer you over directly to the site.
Anita, I was going to say, I just wanted to, I think, can you reread that question, Donna?
Sure, I can reread it. How are emergency-type calls handled or triaged by the clinical trial navigators? Are those types of situations or special circumstance calls shared back with the organization, in this instance with the Colon Cancer Alliance or Fight Colorectal Cancer?
I was just a little confused about the term emergency calls, because Penina's talking one track, and we've also received calls about an emergency with the actual treatment of a clinical trial, which is something quite different. So So, Panina, you can go ahead with your explanation. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No worries at all. I didn't understand the question like that, but we can answer both versions of the question, and thank you, Rob. So if someone is looking for trials and needs it very quickly, chances are you'll reach someone live, and if not, we'll be returning your call within 3 business hours. So we're following up with you pretty quickly. If there is an emergency with a clinical trial, then we do have a process in the call center around reporting adverse events. We work with a number of pharmaceutical companies, and they're certainly required to report those events to the FDA. Physicians who are involved in clinical trials, investigators in clinical trials, are required to report those situations immediately to the FDA. And we would help you reach back out to your physician if there was an actual emergency within a clinical trial. The information that we provide back to our partners, the Colon Cancer Alliance and Fight Colorectal Cancer, is always de-identified. The identity of the caller or the patient is always removed. We have a very strict privacy policy that ensures that the service is confidential at all times.
Okay, the next question. Are you ever too sick to participate in a clinical trial?
Unfortunately, that is the case. The performance of somebody, what they call the performance status of a patient, is very important. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, there just might be some rigor with the actual obtaining the treatment itself. And by that I mean if somebody's unable to maybe get out of bed and the clinical trial is calling for them to be at a facility 3 times a week, that's not really going to be a realistic situation. Alternatively, there might be a clinical trial where they're testing something that might be known to possibly tax the body or tax the system. And if somebody's general health is failing, they might not be in a good position to join a clinical trial. Every clinical trial has specific eligibility points that would exclude a patient, and this would be run through, and they vary per clinical trial. But just as kind of a general piece of information, they tend to be, if you have severe kidney problems, severe liver problems, maybe some severe cardiac issues, they tend not to allow folks with those types of secondary comorbid conditions on clinical trials. But again, every clinical trial is different, and they all have different eligibility criteria. So it would be important to investigate. But again, it's going to come down to the types of treatment and then the details of the eligibility criteria outlined in the protocol.
Okay, the next question. I asked my doctor if I was eligible for any clinical trials, and he said no. But is that because he doesn't have time to look for me, or am I to assume I really am not eligible? I don't want my doctor getting mad at me for asking about this.
And that is a great question. It's something we hear a lot. I can actually let Panina speak to this a little bit more with her knowledge of the call center, but the general answer there is that it's really both. You've nailed it on the head. I think some doctors are afraid to lose their patient. So often if the doctor isn't conducting the clinical trial themselves and a patient gets referred and decides they want to join a clinical trial, they're going to be leaving the care of their physician, of that oncologist. And a lot of times that's not, an oncologist doesn't like to give up their patient. And so that's just the nature of the dynamic there. Sometimes doctors, they just don't have the time to know everything that's out there. And as you can see, there's just an incredible amount of research going on. And this is exactly what the service and organizations like Fight Colorectal Cancer and the Colon Cancer Alliance are trying to do, is to leverage this information in a way that the patient can access it. So there's a couple ways to answer that, and there's a couple ways to go about correcting that. But I think the main thing is that you empower yourself to know everything that's out there and discuss it with your doctor. The doctor should not get mad. I don't think that should ever be an issue. But maybe they won't promote that specific clinical trial or the research studies that you brought to their attention, and then you deserve a rational explanation why, and you should want to agree with that. And if you don't, then it's your right to go and find something that suits your particular needs.
So this question kind of follows up with that and is along those same lines. What happens when I bring the suggested trials to my doctor? What if he or she doesn't think it's a good idea or a good trial? Can I still participate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The decision ultimately is the patient's. And so it's their decision to make. They don't have to agree with their doctor. And often you hear people getting second, third opinions and trying different oncologists. It's really just an informed process. It's just being educated along the whole way and making the decision that's right for you and your family.
And if I could just jump in, that's something we hear all the time in the call center. And you do not need your doctor's permission to reach out to a clinical trial site and learn more. The other thing is that you can bring back any of the match results we provide you and ask specifically why your doctor doesn't think you might be appropriate for, or one of those trials might not be appropriate for you. There could be an underlying reason or an underlying thought process that your doctor had that he or she didn't discuss with you yet, and having that dialogue is really important. But if ultimately you want to explore a different treatment option, that's your prerogative, and we'll help you reach the right people who can help answer those questions.
Okay, the next question is, are there clinical trials out there for stage 4 recurrent colorectal cancer patients that have already had first and second line treatments? We've been told by several physicians that none exist.
They do exist, but they tend to be far and few between. I know for a fact that there's definitely ones out there for advanced stage after you've been refractory to 1, 2 drugs. A lot of times these trials tend up being earlier phase trials. So, again, if you remember earlier when we discussed the phase trials, phase 1 trials often aren't going to be specific for, say, colorectal cancer, which could be frustrating, could be immediately off your list. So that brings you to phase 2 and 3 trials, which they're not as frequently out there for that. Now, I can't say 100% that I know of a trial that is. I feel like I know I've seen them in other tumor types, and they do exist, but to know if there's a phase 2 or 3, I'm really not sure.
Okay. What if there is no clinical trial in my area?
So that's something that comes up very frequently as well. Clinical trials are conducted at specific sites. Oftentimes, whoever is creating the trial is trying to, if it's a higher phase trial like a phase 3 trial, they're trying to create it in many different sites across the country. But sometimes it's not geographically close to you. There are a couple of options available. Certainly, we can help you with transportation resources if that would be appropriate for you. It could be that we can find a trial for you that's in an area where you could stay for whatever reason. We have many people who call and say that they can stay with a relative in a different city. Or we can help you find trials that are located in your geographic region, even if it isn't the initial trial that you call to ask about.
Okay, the next question. Are there any promising new treatment options in the works for stage 4 patients?
I won't talk about specific treatments. I don't think it's probably too appropriate, but there 100% are exciting new things for stage 4 patients. There's a lot of new agents, and there's a lot of new classes of agents, and I'd say, to me personally, some of the most exciting advances have been when the more you learn about the specifics of a tumor. And by that I mean the more you understand about the biology, some of those terms we used before, about the genetic mutations or the biomarkers that are associated with your tumor, the more informed decision you can make about the targeted agents that are out there being developed for those tumors.
Okay, the next question is there any information about an experimental treatment called HIPEC?
I don't know the answer to that offhand. If there's any information in regards to a clinical trial being conducted with it.
Okay. The next question is, how are IRB-approved studies included as possible matches which may not, for some reason, be captured from clinicaltrials.gov?
So the baseline of our database is equivalent of clinicaltrials.gov. Our database should have all treatment and supportive care trials. So treatment trials for your cancer, or supportive care, which are anything that help you with whatever the trial is causing. We should be the baseline of clinicaltrials.gov and of cancer.gov. Those two clinical trials databases from the government are our baseline. In addition to that, if there is an IRB-approved site that isn't included in clinicaltrials.gov, if the site reaches out to us, and we do have relationships with a number of sites, we'll enter it into the database as well. In addition to that, before we refer you to a clinical trial site, we will call the site, not just for you, but for all patients who might be interested in that site. Make sure that we have the right contact information for that site. The real difference between the Clinical Trials Matching Service and clinicaltrials.gov are two issues. The first, with the matching service, you match to specific trials. With clinicaltrials.gov, you will see a list of clinical trials, but you may not understand or you may not be able to tell if they're right for your unique situation. The second part of that is all of our information is vetted. We have a team here that verifies the information that we put into our database. Sometimes with clinicaltrials.gov, whoever creates the trial inputs the information in the beginning, and then people at the site change, study coordinators turn over. The information there isn't always completely up to date. We work to make sure that that information is up to date, and we navigate you to the correct place.
Okay.
Donna, I just wanted to add, actually, yes. I did just a quick look at the database. There's at least 2 or 3 trials that are open using the HIPEC procedure, and those are treatment trials. And there's a couple others that are open that are more kind of assessment and quality of life things.
Oh, great, great. Okay, so moving on to the next question. What if I get the placebo and I hinder my treatment or my tumor spreads? How do you guarantee that won't happen?
So that's one of the misperceptions about cancer clinical trials. A placebo is often an unethical thing to use, and it's rarely used in a cancer clinical trial. And often clinical trials, the placebo or the control group will be the standard of care. And then the experimental group will be the standard of care plus an additional agent. Now, clinical trials, most of them, especially in Phase 2, Phase 3, are randomized. And what this means is that a computer is basically going to choose who goes into the control group and who goes into the experimental group. And then on top of that, clinical trials can either be blinded or double-blinded, which means either you or both you and your treating physician have no idea who is getting which treatment. So it's, that's how it's protected. There's really, that's part of the things you would learn throughout the informed consent process, and you'd have to be very clear in your understanding of your potential to go into the control group. So that has to be part of your decision process and something that you seriously weigh. But it should be just really stressed that an actual placebo or a quote-unquote sugar pill is rarely used in cancer clinical trials.
And whatever treatment option you might receive, whichever treatment path you might receive as part of a clinical trial, is very clearly laid out in the informed consent. It's written very, very clearly, and it's given to you in advance before you sign, so you understand what treatments you may receive if the trial is randomized and if you're put into a group and not sure which group you're put in. All of that is given to you in advance in writing.
Okay, great. It appears that I do not have any other questions, so I'm going to move towards transition to ending the webinar unless anyone else has any other ones coming in at the last second here. Okay. On behalf of the Colon Cancer Alliance, I would like to thank our speakers, Robert Rutigliano and Penina Seidman from EmergingMed, as well as Carly Bowman from Fight Colorectal Cancer for their participation in this webinar. I hope as a participant you leave this webinar tonight with the information you were seeking. Shortly, you will receive an email from the Colon Cancer Alliance asking you to participate in an online survey. The Colon Cancer Alliance values your opinion, and we would like to hear what you have to say about this webinar. As a thank you for participating in the survey, you will be entered into a drawing to win one of 2 $10 Target gift cards. Please also remember that this webinar will be available for 90 days as a replay in case you would like to hear the presentation or the question and answer period over again. Because you've already registered, you can access that webinar again easily by entering your information online. Thank you and good night.